You crossed the line. That's a violation.
I followed procedure. Check the logs.
You're right, my mistake.
Acknowledged.
The dawn sun cast long shadows across the tarmac of Charleston Regional Airport as Captain Mitchell. Hayes conducted his pre-flight inspection with the precision of a man who had flown countless times but never felt truly satisfied. At 58, years old, with a weather-beaten face and eyes that had seen every kind of sky imaginable, Mitchell was a legend in regional aviation, the kind of pilot that other pilots called when they needed someone fearless. But fear Mitchell was beginning to understand had never been his enemy. His real opponent was change. The charter company had sent him a message the night before. His co-pilot would be changing. His usual first officer, Tom Brennan, had called in sick, and dispatch was assigning someone new. That someone was Dr. Victoria Monroe, a name that meant nothing to Mitchell until he saw her emerge from the terminal building. She was a black woman, impeccably dressed in her pilot's uniform, walking with the kind of confidence that made Mitchell's chest tighten with inexplicable anger. He didn't understand where the anger came from, and he certainly wouldn't admit it to anyone. But as he watched her approach, something inside him crystallized into resistance. This wasn't going to work. Mitchell didn't even wait for Victoria to reach the cockpit. He intercepted her near the aircraft stairs, his voice gruff and his manner dismissive. "Listen," he said without greeting her properly. "I don't know what dispatch was thinking, but we need to sort this out right now. The flight to Savannah is a critical run. We've got important cargo, and the weather pattern is developing on the horizon. I need a co-pilot I can trust, someone who knows these routes, someone seasoned." Victoria paused, one hand still on the handrail, and looked at him with an expression that suggested she had encountered this exact moment before, perhaps many times. "Captain Hayes, I assume," she said calmly, extending her hand in greeting. "I'm Dr. Victoria Monroe. I'm your first officer for today's operation. I have 12,000 flight hours. I'm type-rated for this aircraft, and I have 3 advanced degrees, one of which is in aviation safety." Mitchell stared at her hand as if it were something dangerous, and deliberately turned away. "I don't care about credentials," he said coldly. "I care about instinct. And my instinct tells me you're not the right fit for this particular mission." Victoria's hand slowly lowered to her side. Her jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady, controlled, professional. "Is there a specific operational concern, Captain? Or are you simply refusing to fly with me based on what you see standing in front of you?" The confrontation moved into the operations office, away from the public eye, but it only grew more heated. Mitchell sat across from the dispatch supervisor, his arms crossed, his voice rising with every word. "I've flown over 60,000 hours without incident," he declared loudly. "I've trained pilots. I've mentored captains who now work for the majors. And I'm telling you, this doesn't feel right." The female dispatcher, clearly uncomfortable, glanced at Victoria, who stood by the window with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "Captain Hayes," the supervisor began carefully, "Victoria's record is exceptional. She's passed every certification exam on the first attempt. Her evaluations are perfect. There's no operational reason to deny this crew pairing." Mitchell stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the tile floor. "Then I'm invoking my safety authority as pilot in command," he announced. "I'm refusing this flight assignment. If the company wants to find another captain, they're welcome to try. But Victoria Monroe is not stepping into the right seat of my aircraft." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Victoria's face remained calm, but her eyes betrayed the pain of hearing herself rejected, yet again, for reasons no one would openly speak. The supervisor looked helpless. Victoria turned away from the window and spoke quietly. "I'll wait in the pilot's lounge," she said. "Let me know what dispatch decides for the next hour." Mitchell sat in the captain's ready room, stubbornly waiting while dispatch scrambled to find an alternative co-pilot. The charter company's owner, a businessman named Robert Cheen, called him. Directly, his voice tight with frustration. "Captain, what's going on down there?" "The client is arriving in less than 3 hours." We have a schedule to keep. Mitchell remained unmoved. I'm exercising my authority, he responded, his tone brooking no argument. If you want to replace me with another captain, that's your choice. But I am not flying with an untested first officer. On this particular run, Chun didn't push further. He knew Mitchell's value to the company. Instead, he made calls to the major carriers, but every available captain was booked. After more than an hour of tension, dispatch informed Mitchell that there was one other option, bringing in Captain David Russell from the afternoon shift. Russell was excellent, experienced, and importantly to Mitchell, one of the old guard, a white man in his 60s who had been flying since the early 80s. Perfect, Mitchell said, visibly relieved. Get Russell. The message made its way to Victoria, still waiting alone in the pilot's lounge. She read the text message from dispatch, and something shifted inside her. Something cold and calculating. She made a phone call 20 minutes later. As Mitchell was preparing the aircraft for Russell's arrival, a town car pulled up on the tarmac. Out stepped an impeccably dressed woman with silver hair and sharp business attire, Victoria Monroe's mother, Dr. Eleanor Monroe, along with two men in dark suits carrying briefcases. They walked directly past the security checkpoint without hesitation, clearly expected, and made their way to the operations office. Minutes later, the operations supervisor came looking for Mitchell with a look of profound confusion on his face. Captain Hayes, he said carefully, you're going to want to speak with Miss Monroe right away. Who's Miss Monroe? Mitchell asked, though he had a sinking feeling he knew the answer. The supervisor gestured toward the office, where Victoria now sat, with her mother and what appeared to be legal representatives. Mitchell's stomach twisted as he approached. Captain Hayes, Victoria said, standing to greet him formally. I'd like you to meet my mother, Dr. Eleanor Monroe, and these are representatives from Monroe Aviation Holdings. Eleanor extended her hand with a warm smile. Captain Hayes, such a pleasure. My daughter has spoken highly of your reputation. Mitchell was bewildered. What is this? He asked, his voice uncertain for the first time. Victoria gestured to one of the lawyers, who opened a briefcase and removed several documents. Captain, these men have informed me that there's been a significant development that affects this flight. Victoria explained, her tone matter of fact. Over the past 6 months, Monroe Aviation Holdings has completed the acquisition of all assets pertaining to this charter operation. As of this morning, we took full operational control. The lawyer stepped forward with a document. The new ownership has reviewed all existing crew assignments and determined that Dr. Victoria Monroe, as a certified pilot and now as a representative of the company's ownership structure, will be the first officer on today's charter. However, they've also determined that the captain needs to be someone the new ownership can trust to uphold our values. Mitchell's face went pale. What are you saying? He asked, though the answer was becoming terrifyingly clear. The lawyer adjusted. His glasses? We're saying, Captain, that your refusal to fly with a qualified pilot based on race violates not only FAA regulations regarding crew resource management, but also constitutes a civil rights violation under federal law. This company is now under new ownership, and we will not be party to discrimination. You have two choices, Captain. You can apologize to Dr. Monroe, complete this flight as a professional, and we'll discuss your future with the company. Or you can walk away, and we'll provide the FAA with documentation of this incident. Mitchell looked at Victoria, searching her face for any sign of mercy, but he found only professional resolve. You orchestrated this, he said quietly. You knew your mother owned this company. Victoria's expression remained neutral. What I knew, Captain, she said carefully, is that I'm a highly qualified pilot. And what I discovered in the past hour is that I didn't need to prove that anymore. The company I work for believes in merit. Do you? Mitchell had no response. Back in the operations office, with the dispatchers watching and the entire staff suddenly aware of what had transpired, Mitchell faced the reality of his situation. Captain Russell had already been called and informed that the assignment was canceled. Robert Chen, the original company owner, now relegated to a minor consulting role, had been informed of the acquisition. Mitchell's phone had begun receiving calls from colleagues who had somehow heard the news. The world was closing in. Eleanor Monroe addressed him with unexpected kindness. "Captain Hayes," she said, "my daughter could have handled this differently. She could have filed complaints immediately, escalated through the FAA, sued for discrimination. But instead she came to me and said she wanted you to have a choice. She wanted you to see that times are changing, that merit matters more than demographics, and that there's still room in this industry for people like you if you're willing to grow. And that was your daughter's choice." Mitchell asked, looking at Victoria. "Not mine," Victoria confirmed. "I wanted to expose you immediately. My mother believed in redemption. She thought maybe you were simply stuck in old patterns. But the choice has to be yours, Captain. Will you fly with me today? Or will you walk away from your career?" Mitchell excused himself and walked out onto the tarmac, the morning sun now fierce and unforgiving. For nearly 40 years, he had been the authority in the sky, the undisputed leader of every crew, the veteran whose experience was never questioned. And now, in a single hour, his entire identity had been dismantled. He thought about his daughter, who worked as a prosecutor, and had told him months ago that his attitudes were from another era. He thought about the young pilots he trained. Some of them women, some of them minorities, all of them competent and eager. He thought about the man he'd been, and the man he'd become, and the man he might still become. His phone buzzed. A text from Eleanor Monroe. "If you choose to continue as captain today, Dr. Monroe will be your first officer, and you will treat her with the respect she deserves. Walk away clean, and we'll offer you a consulting position working with new pilots on crew dynamics. Either way, this company believes you have value. The question is whether you believe that about yourself." Mitchell sat on a bench for 20 minutes, watching planes take off and land, watching the sky he'd loved for so long, trying to decide if his pride was worth more than his purpose. When Mitchell returned to the operations office, his face was haggard, aged by the weight of the morning. He looked directly at Victoria and said 2 words, "I'm sorry." Not the elaborate apology she deserved, but a beginning. Victoria nodded. "Then we should begin our pre-flight checklist," she said professionally. "We have a client arriving in 90 minutes. Eleanor Monroe smiled, and the lawyers began packing their briefcases. As Mitchell and Victoria walked toward the aircraft together, Eleanor called out, "Captain, one more thing. The next plane Dr. Monroe acquires, she's planning to name it something special. I think she might name it after someone who chose growth over ego. The Redemption, perhaps." Mitchell didn't respond, but his shoulders straightened just slightly, and for the first time that morning, he didn't object to walking alongside Dr. Victoria Monroe. The pre-flight checklist began in near silence. The only sounds are mechanical. Responses of the aircraft and the professional terminology that united all pilots regardless of background. The tension that had been thick enough to cut with a knife had transformed into something else, not friendliness, but the beginning of mutual respect. Victoria walked through each system check with the precision of someone who had done this thousands of times, and Mitchell, forced to listen rather than dismiss, began to hear the confidence in her voice. At one point, she caught an anomaly in the fuel management system that Mitchell had missed during his earlier inspection. Rather than staying silent and risking safety, Victoria flagged it immediately. "There's a discrepancy in the crossfeed valve. Calibration," she noted, pointing to the digital readout. "Minor, but it could compound under certain weather conditions. We should ground it until maintenance verifies." Mitchell felt a spike of defensive anger rise in his chest. She had found something he'd missed, but he pushed it down. "You're right," he said, making the call to dispatch. "Good catch." It was a small moment, but it was authentic. The aircraft wouldn't fly until maintenance had cleared the valve, which pushed their timeline back by 2 hours. The client, a venture capitalist named Susan Walsh, was frustrated but understanding. "What matters," she told Eleanor Monroe in the operations office, "is that you're taking every precaution. I've heard stories about pilots cutting corners. That's not the kind of service I'm paying for as the maintenance team worked on the fuel." System. Mitchell and Victoria sat in the pilot's lounge, and they began to talk. Not about the morning's confrontation, but about flying. Victoria mentioned she had originally wanted to be a commercial astronaut before deciding that aviation's daily challenges held more appeal. Mitchell found himself genuinely interested. He asked about her advanced degrees, and she explained that. She believed in understanding the science behind the controls, not just knowing how to manipulate them. Mitchell realized with a mix of shame and surprise that Victoria's background was entirely composed of things he admired: rigor, preparation, continuous learning, just delivered in a package he'd been trained by his culture to dismiss. Victoria asked Mitchell about his career, and he found himself telling stories he hadn't shared in years. About his first solo flight, about the time he'd successfully navigated a dual-engine failure through sheer force of will, about why he loved the sky. Victoria listened, really listened, and Mitchell felt something inside him begin to soften. He must have learned a lot of that from somewhere, Victoria said thoughtfully. Yes, Mitchell replied honestly, from an entire career of assuming I was always the smartest person in the room. Clearly, I was wrong about that. Maintenance cleared the aircraft just as new weather reports came through. A storm system was developing over their planned route, and the meteorological briefing was complex. The conditions were legal to fly through, but they required precision and coordination. Eleanor Monroe, now watching from the operations office, had intentionally requested that the weather briefing include the final decision-making authority shared between both pilot and first officer. This was unusual. Typically, the captain made these calls alone, but Monroe Aviation was changing the culture. Victoria and Mitchell sat side by side reviewing the weather data, discussing wind shears, icing levels, and the best altitude to climb through turbulent air. They disagreed on one parameter. Victoria wanted to request a higher altitude, while Mitchell thought they could manage at the planned level. Rather than demanding obedience, Mitchell asked her reasoning. The upper-level winds show a jet stream anomaly, Victoria explained, pulling up the specific satellite data. I think we climbed through it quickly. Mitchell studied the data and nodded. Slowly. You're right. We go higher. It's a better strategy. They presented this amended flight plan to dispatch together, and Susan Walsh, observing the professional discussion, remarked to Eleanor Monroe, "That's the kind of crew I want in the cockpit. Two pilots making smart decisions together." The weather was indeed building, dark clouds gathering on the horizon like an approaching army. Mitchell conducted the pre-flight briefing with Victoria standing beside him, not behind him. He explained the flight plan in detail, acknowledged Victoria's elevation adjustment, and specifically asked for her input on crew responsibilities during the anticipated turbulence. "I want you to monitor our electrical load during climb," he said to Victoria. "With the advanced weather system we might be using, I need to know if we're pushing the generators hard." "Will do, Captain," Victoria replied, and the word captain carried. No sting or sarcasm. It simply meant acknowledgement of role. The client, Susan Walsh, was in the cabin. Just before the cabin doors closed, she approached the cockpit. "I'm glad I'm flying with both of you," she said simply. "Both of you, not just the captain." The words affected Mitchell more than he could express. They taxied out into position, and the control tower cleared them for takeoff. The runway stretched ahead, a concrete river leading into the uncertain sky. Mitchell advanced the throttles, and the twin engines roared to life. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, Mitchell felt Victoria's hands on her yoke, moving. In perfect coordination with his, both pilots working as one unit, one consciousness, one commitment to safe flight. The wheels left the earth, and they climbed into the churning sky. The turbulence hit harder than the forecast predicted. The aircraft pitched and rolled through waves of angry air. Mitchell had been through worse, but this was bad enough. That Susan Walsh in the cabin was gripping her armrests, bad enough that the autopilot was struggling to hold altitude. Victoria was calling out readings, communicating with air traffic control, monitoring fuel distribution as the aircraft compensated for the weather. Mitchell was flying the plane by feel and instinct, years of experience guiding his hands. But it was Victoria's voice, steady and analytical, that kept him grounded in data. Wind shear warning at 3,000 feet, she called. Shifting to 20 degrees left of our planned vector. Mitchell acknowledged and adjusted course. The two of them moved through the storm like dancers who had practiced for years, each anticipating the other's movements, each trusting completely. For nearly 40 minutes, they flew through conditions that would have terrified many pilots. But Mitchell found that with Victoria's competence verified in real time, with her expertise making a measurable difference in their safety, his anxiety shifted to focus. This was flying at its purest, not about ego or authority, but about survival. And precision. As they emerged from the other side of the storm, climbing into clearer air, the tension broke. Susan Walsh appeared in the cockpit, visibly shaken but unharmed. That was intense, she said, gripping the armrest. Captain Hayes, Dr. Monroe, you flew that beautifully. Completely synchronized. Mitchell glanced at Victoria, and for the first time, they shared a genuine smile. We make a good team, he said simply. Victoria nodded. We do. The rest of the flight to Savannah was smooth and uneventful. But the transformation had already occurred. Mitchell found himself asking Victoria questions about her flying philosophy, her training methods, her perspective on emerging pilot safety technologies. Victoria answered each question thoughtfully, and she also asked Mitchell questions about his experience, his knowledge of older aircraft systems, his insights on crew psychology. They weren't just flying together anymore. They were genuinely connecting as professionals who respected each other. The approach into Savannah. International was textbook perfect. Mitchell called the runway. Victoria confirmed the landing checklist. And the aircraft touched down with barely a whisper. Susan Walsh had already texted Eleanor Monroe. This is the future of aviation. 2 excellent pilots, no ego, all competence. As they taxied to the gate, Mitchell made a radio call to dispatch. Charter 874 is secure. Outstanding flight conditions thanks to exceptional crew coordination. Eleanor Monroe, hearing the transmission in the operations office, smiled at Victoria's mother. I think your daughter is going to do very well as the operational director of this company, Eleanor observed. Victoria's mother laughed. Actually, she already is. The paperwork went through this morning. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. Then your daughter now answers to herself. Victoria's mother smiled. No, she answers to the values she set for Monroe Aviation Holdings. That's the only oversight she needs. Back in the cockpit, Mitchell and Victoria completed their post-flight checklist in silence. But it was a comfortable silence. As they stood to exit, Mitchell extended his hand. Thank you, he said. For what? For not giving up on me this morning. For showing me what flying could be with a real partner. Victoria shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Captain, she replied, for being willing to grow in the operations office. Eleanor Monroe and Victoria met with Mitchell and formally offered him a position. We're restructuring the flight operations, Eleanor explained. We need captains who understand that the future of aviation isn't about who's been here longest. It's about who's best. We'd like you to work with Dr. Monroe on developing a new crew training program, one that emphasizes partnership over hierarchy, one that ensures every pilot, regardless of background, gets the opportunity to prove their value. Interested? Mitchell looked at Victoria, who waited without pressure for his response. You're going to let me teach? He asked. We're going to let you learn first, Victoria corrected gently. But yes, eventually, I think your experience is valuable. If you can approach it without the prejudices that held you back. Mitchell took a breath. I want to try, he said. EchoStory's cameras captured the final moments of this story weeks later. A new training facility had been established, bearing a plaque. That read, the Monroe Hayes Pilots Academy, Excellence Through Respect. Mitchell was in front of a classroom of 12 student pilots, men, women, white and black and Hispanic and Asian, teaching them the fundamentals of crew resource management. Victoria sat in the back of the room, observing, offering feedback. During a break, a young black female student thanked Mitchell specifically for explaining the science behind lateral G-force management in such clear language. Mitchell realized she had been watching him for any signs of bias, and finding none, she had opened herself to learning. This was the real work. This was the redemption that Eleanor Monroe had offered him, and he was finally beginning to understand its value. Like and subscribe to EchoStory if you believe that people can change, that growth is possible, and that the sky has room for everyone willing to master it with dedication and respect. 6 months later, Captain Mitchell Hayes sat in the captain's chair of a charter flight, and in the first officer's seat sat Dr. Victoria Monroe. They had flown together 100 times now, and their coordination was flawless. But the real victory came when they welcomed a student pilot, a young Latina woman named Sophia, into the jump seat for her observation hours. At the end of the flight, as they taxied to the gate, Mitchell turned to both of them and said words that had taken him a lifetime to mean. The best pilot I've ever flown with taught me that the title on the uniform doesn't determine your worth. Your knowledge does. Your character does. Your willingness to help the crew next to you succeed. That's what makes a captain. Victoria smiled, and Sophia's face brightened with hope. The sky stretched endlessly ahead of them, vast enough for everyone, finally, to belong. Subscribe to EchoStory for more stories of transformation, justice, and the power of redemption.